Okay, of course, I am Robert Greene II, Assistant Professor of History at Claflin, and also lead instructor for the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. And I want to wish everyone a hearty welcome once again to the Modjeska School this evening. Of course, I have to find a way to follow that up somehow, so that's not going to be easy. But I am grateful that we're able to hear some of those words from John Brown. Now, tonight, in many ways, is going to be a three-part conversation. First part, of course, is about the events that lead to South Carolina's secession from the Union. I think a good part of this is history that you may know, but we want to put it into further context. For one, especially explaining how the Palmetto State, being the first that leaves the Union, really sparked a secessionist crusade across the South in the winter of 1860 and 61. Secondly, of course, we'll talk about the American Civil War and its immediate aftermath. Of course, the war itself greatly and gravely affects South Carolina in so many different ways. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on Reconstruction, but also a bit of time on how the history of the secession period and Civil War has been written about in South Carolina. I was just talking to Chris a moment ago. I was showing him a book that Brett gifted to me last year, the Sims History of South Carolina, that I'm holding right here. In case you did not believe Brett when he mentioned what the state textbook was like for so long, here is ample proof of what he was talking about. And this evening, I will read a few passages from this textbook, and well, you'll see how the interpretation of the Civil War era has changed over time, at least for most Americans. Now, before we get into today's lecture, I want to, of course, have a few more folks on Zoom introduce themselves. And if I call your name, please unmute yourselves. Also turn on your camera and tell us a bit about where you're zooming in from and what brings you to the Modjeska School this semester. Again, this is all because we weren't able to do so on the day of introduction, so we want to have that done. And again, take your time with this. We're not trying to rush anyone, but we do want to get to know each and every one of you. So the first person I'd like to call on this evening is Tayaba Sadiq. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Tayaba Sadiq. I am auditing the class, and I was lucky enough to participate several years ago and learn from Dr. Greene. I'm very motivated to get to know and understand our history and try and learn from it, because I feel like if you know history, you learn the lessons from it and you try your best not to repeat it. Some of the work that I'm very interested in is working towards peace and towards human rights. So that's what really attracted me to the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights and Civil Rights. And lastly, the thing that I've been greatly encouraged by, because I started the class at a time when I felt very agitated, seeing all the people who've been doing it for years and years and years before me, and realizing that it's sometimes a long struggle. There is hope. There's wonderful changes that come, but not to give up and if you don't have instant results. So thank you so much for everything you're doing and teaching.
Oh, thank you for joining us again. I was excited to see you in the class once more. And again, that's a reminder that there are a lot of folks who come back to the class every year. This is one of the reasons why I try to add something different every time I teach it. All right, up next, Marla Sullivan, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Marla. Hi, I'm Marla Sullivan. I am from the Lancaster County area and am involved with both the Lancaster County Democratic Women's Council and with the Lancaster County Democratic Party. And I did not grow up in this area. I grew up in the Kansas City area. So all of this is completely new information for me. And I'm just looking forward to trying to find whatever possible to make change in our state.
Thank you so much for that, Marla. And don't feel too bad. I am from the neighboring state of Georgia. And when I moved here in 2012 to pursue my PhD in history, I realized there was a lot I did not know about the Palmetto State. So don't feel too bad at all. All right. Up next, Kaylin Patrick, please.
Just a second, sorry.
Oh, sure, no worries.
Trying to figure out how to start my video. Hi guys, I'm Kaylin. I live in Columbia. I can't seem to get my camera going. Sorry about that. But I work for the South Carolina Commission on Indigent Defense, specifically working in the Division of Appellate Defense, helping our incarcerated neighbors pursue their criminal appeals. And I'm just here to learn how to look towards the leaders of the past so that I can better engage my neighbors towards building a more equitable society together.
All right, thank you so much for that. Okay, up next, Clarence Dollison, please.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Clarence Dollison, and I'm a retired physician right now, and with a little bit of extra time on my hands, and I'm looking at this CRT debate, and I would, like to get some information about that and see are there any groups I could join with that. In addition to, I've been reading the rest of the lectures and that kind of thing and all, and I mean, there's some very interesting things here. South Carolina is a real trip.
I think, Brett, I think we should use that next year for the tagline for the class.
Well, Dr. Dollison, he's Christian, so he's raised a lot of these people that we're trying to manipulate.
Oh, okay. All right, and up next, let's go ahead and have Joyce Argo introduce yourself, please.
Dr. Greene, I introduced myself last week, but if you'd like for me to do it again this week, I could.
Oh, no worries. My apologies for that. Let me go ahead.
It is certainly okay. And I just want to say, as a native of South Carolina and of the hometown where you are currently a professor at Claflin University, we're so glad that you are here in the Palmetto State.
Oh, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. I'm certainly glad to be here. I know that we talk so much about the bad things in South Carolina, both historically and in the current day, but I think institutions like the Progressive Network and the Modjeska School prove that there is a lot of good in the state as well. We just have to cultivate it and let it grow. Let's see.
Robert, let me add something there about the good news, and this is what I told Dr. Dollison. He was interested in the critical race theory. It's really pretty depressing on the one hand, when you look at South Carolina's brutal history, but on the other hand, it's really inspirational to know that what we're digging up here is this continual resistance, evidencing the same values that we have today. That's the problem, is it keeps getting erased and people keep thinking they're the first ones to desire civilization. So that's the reason for us keeping the Modjeska School alive for another generation.
Exactly.
Thank you, Dr. Green.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I think what we're going to do now, let's go ahead, if you want, we can start the class now, really dive into tonight's lecture. We'll get some more folks next week. But as I said at the start of class this afternoon, one of the things about this moment in South Carolina's history in the 1850s and 1860s is that the state itself is really trying to come to grips with the fact that the abolitionist movement is starting to grow across the North. One thing about that, though, is that I am going to reference a few passages from the Sims history of South Carolina, because I think when we think about the Modjeska School, one of the things that we're trying to do here is to correct some of the long-standing narratives in the Palmetto State about the state's past. And many of those narratives really have their origins in books like the Sims history of South Carolina. So, as an example, I want to read to you a passage from the Sims history of South Carolina. Now, this version of the book was released or published rather in 1932, again by Mary C. Sims Oliphant. And it says here on page 195, the chapter, South Carolina secedes from the Union. By 1850, there were hundreds of anti-slavery societies organized for the purpose of doing away with slavery in the United States. Pamphlets, which often contained untruthful statements about the condition of the slaves, were mailed all over the country urging the anti-slavery cause. Lecturers spoke out in the most violent terms against slavery. The wise leaders of the North, such as Daniel Webster, tried to stamp out this anti-slavery campaign, fearing it would break up the Union. But nothing could stop the abolitionists, as the people who agitated against slavery were called. Some went so far as to try to stir the slaves to rise and kill their masters. So I think what you see from the Sims textbook is that the abolitionists are the ones who are really blamed for causing secession and the Civil War. And I think this is especially interesting to note because if you recall, at the end of last week's class, one of the things that I pointed out was that the abolitionist movement was seen as a serious threat to the institution of slavery in the South, and especially in South Carolina. As you may recall, I ended class last week talking about the Greene sisters and how they were an integral part of the abolitionist movement in the mid-19th century. Now, oftentimes, when we talk about abolitionism, we talk about figures such as Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison. But I think it's also worth noting folks like the Greene sisters who had to leave South Carolina to really pursue the ideals of abolitionism. Now, the Greene sisters came from a family that actually owned slaves, but they both believed that the cause of resisting slavery was what was required of their Christian teachings and their Christian upbringing. Now, the Sims textbook, again, it points out how they blame the abolitionists for agitating on the issue of slavery. Now, there are a couple of things about that I think is worth pointing out. Number one, it basically erases the fears, emotions, and thoughts of 4 million men, women, and children who were enslaved. This is a long-standing tradition in American history of erasing the agency of Black people. We see this a lot in the 20th century with the Civil Rights Movement, with these arguments of quote unquote outside agitators trying to stir up trouble amongst the Negroes. Same is true in the 19th century, at least according to the Sims textbook about South Carolina. But secondly, the abolitionist cause was deeply feared throughout the South. And as I mentioned last week, in the 1830s, the postmaster and his subordinates in Charleston even took the extraordinary step of burning the very pamphlets that the Sims textbook mentions were severe threats to the livelihood of white South Carolinians. Now, abolitionism, it should be noted, never became a majority even in the North. I think it becomes very easy to think of this as a situation where it's an abolitionist North versus a slavery South. That's not quite the case. The abolitionists were a minority even in the North. In many cases, abolitionists like Douglass, like Garrison, like the Greene sisters, like many others, risked their lives to speak out against slavery in the North. For example, in the 1830s, there was a serious campaign by the abolitionists to speak out against slavery. That was continued in the 1840s as well. Individuals like Frederick Douglass were actually attacked by mobs throughout the North for daring to speak out against abolition. Never mind even trying to broach the idea of abolitionism in the Deep South. I think this is an important lesson for all of us in the Modjeska School, especially for those of you who want to become activists, who want to become involved in making a change for everyday people in the Palmetto State. What you may find is that for many years, perhaps your entire lifetime, you will be in the minority. But that does not mean the cause is not just. On the contrary, that makes the cause all the more worthwhile. However, one thing we haven't discussed too much as of yet, and I want to make brief mention of this evening, is the importance of slavery and the slaveocracy, as many in the anti-slavery movement called it, to U.S. foreign policy. Now, the map you see here on the screen shows the expansion of the United States from 1783 and the end of the Revolutionary War up until the end of the war with Mexico in 1848. As you can see, a major part of U.S. history is this westward expansion. It came, of course, mostly at the expense of indigenous peoples, and it was sparked in large part by the need for more land on which to use enslaved labor. Let me give you an example of this. In South Carolina, the history of the state is, I think, a pretty simple one of folks moving further and further inland from the low country for the sake of profit, for the sake of the expansion of slavery. Now, you want to take this idea of the expansion of slavery within South Carolina and throughout the South and expand it throughout what we now call the Old Southwest. The region of Alabama, Mississippi, this part of the South would eventually become part of the United States in the early 19th century. There, slavery would experience new life, in part because of the fact that plantation owners in South Carolina and elsewhere began to purchase more land out west. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the expansion of slavery, when you see further westward expansion, you tend to have this vision of westward expansion as occurring primarily to gain more land for independent farmers, and that's partially true. But in the southern region of the United States, westward expansion was all about continuing slavery. For instance, there were numerous planters in South Carolina who owned land in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And they would often go back and forth from their plantations in one part of the South to the other, maintaining their dominance over both parts of the South. This expansion of territory also manifested itself in other ways as well. Now, as we've already talked about, the slave trade with Africa was stopped in 1808. However, plantation owners and slave owners in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina continued to make a great amount of money, not so much from using slave labor, but from breeding more slaves and selling off those slaves to slave owners in South Carolina, Georgia, and eventually Alabama, Mississippi, and elsewhere in the Deep South. I think this shows how slavery really touched every facet of life in the United States. One could make a legitimate argument that from 1787, the year the Constitution was written, until 1860, the year of secession and the election of Abraham Lincoln, that the United States government, the federal government, was actually, in fact, dominated by the South. Many Supreme Court justices came from the South. Numerous presidents either came from the South or were sympathetic to the South and its quote unquote way of life, i.e. slavery. And this also manifested itself in foreign policy. Let's take the war with Mexico, for example, which lasted from 1846 until 1848. Now, to make a long story short, the War with Mexico had, in many cases, its origins in the US annexation of Texas. And if you don't know much about Texas, what is really important though about Texas is that in the 1820s and 1830s, most of the white American settlers in Texas came from the South, and many of them brought enslaved Africans with them. Now, there was a slight problem with this. When Mexico gained its independence in 1820 from Spain, one of the first things the new state of Mexico began to do was to gradually and pretty soon immediately abolish slavery. Now, the northern half of what was then Mexico, let me go back to the previous slide for a second to show you this. If you look at the territory that's in orange right here, at one point, all of this belonged to Mexico. Now, especially in what was known as Tejas, Texas, the Mexican government encouraged Americans to settle in Tejas in exchange for three things. Number one, the Americans would learn Spanish. Number two, the Americans would convert to Catholicism. And number three, if they were slave owners, they would let their slaves go free. Surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, by the Texan Revolution of 1836, the vast majority of Americans had not learned Spanish. They had not converted to Catholicism. And despite Mexico ending slavery in the 1830s, they had not abolished slavery amongst themselves. One could make the argument that the United States was not sending its best to live in Tejas, but I digress. However, the Texas Revolution, as we know it, remember the Battle of the Alamo, remember the Alamo and all of that in 1836. One of the primary causes of Texas seeking its independence is that many Texans wanted to hold on to their slaves. And many of them wanted to find a way to be annexed by the United States. Now, when the War of Independence for Texas ends in 1836, the Texans appealed to the US government for annexation. Now, I mentioned last week the importance of reading your Constitution. However, surprisingly, the Constitution does not contain within it a provision about what if an independent country seeks annexation by the US government. And so for about 9 years, there was debate in Congress about actually allowing Texas to join the Union. A big part of this debate was the fear that if Texas joined the Union, it would upset the balance of power in the Senate between free states and slave states. It was equal up to that point, but including Texas would give an unequal balance to slave states in the US Senate. And so it wasn't until 1845 that Texas was formally annexed by the US government. However, Mexico had warned the US, if they annexed Texas, it would be an act of war. The US did it anyway, and soon sent troops into Texas to stake their claim to this new territory for the US. I think it's a bit ironic that I'm doing this lecture about a week after the anniversary of the start of the war in Iraq in 2003. Like in 2003, in 1845 and 46, there were serious questions being raised about a potential rush to war within the US government. In fact, in 1846, when American troops arrived in Texas, many believed they were actually in disputed territory that actually belonged to Mexico. There was debate about where the border between Mexico and Texas was. The Texans said it was the Rio Grande, which supports the current border between the US and Mexico. Mexico said, no, it's actually the River Nueces, which is about 150 miles north of the Rio Grande. American troops were between those two rivers, and they were, quote unquote, attacked by the Mexican army. This gave the President of the United States the authority to ask Congress for a declaration of war on Mexico, and that's how the war began. Just a quick side note, in his first and only term in Congress, a young man from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln asked in Congress, show me on this map where American troops were attacked. It was called the Spot Resolutions. And the president at the time refused to answer this question. Now, as you can see here from the medallion on the PowerPoint here, the War with Mexico means a great deal to the people of South Carolina. Now, the Mexican War is perhaps one of the most controversial wars in US history, at least in terms of public reaction to it at the time it was fought. I think we tend to think only of the Vietnam War as the war that really galvanizes Americans against it. But the war with Mexico really rubs many Americans the wrong way, especially in the Northeast. Many New Englanders are deeply opposed to the war. They think it's a bad idea. In fact, at one point during the war, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famed essayist and philosopher, is put in jail for not paying his taxes to support the war. And his friend Henry David Thoreau comes to jail to get him out. And Thoreau asks Emerson, what are you doing in there in his jail cell? And Emerson's response was, what are you doing out there? Saying that he should be doing more to oppose the war as well. Frederick Douglass, another abolitionist, spoke out against the War of Mexico, rightly seeing it as an attempt to expand slave territory for at the expense of the lives of Mexicans, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. Now, the Palmetto Regiment, which was raised in South Carolina, is an example of what this war looked like to many white Southerners who acknowledged it as a war to expand slavery westward. Out of the 1,100 soldiers who fought for the Palmetto Regiment in the Mexican War, only about 300 returned. But this is also indicative of how the war was broadly supported in the South. Most of the troops who fought in the Mexican War, especially in all volunteer regiments, came from Southern states. For example, if you've ever wondered why the University of Tennessee is known as the Volunteers, or why Tennessee is known as the volunteer state, because of the volunteers for this particular war. However, the War of Mexico, while it was a successful war for the US, there were some qualms about how the war was fought and why the war was fought. None other than John C. Calhoun himself raised some of these questions at the end of the war. Around 1850, Calhoun said, quote, "The day of retribution will come, and when it does, awful will be the reckoning, and heavy the responsibilities somewhere," end quote. In other words, even Calhoun, ever the erstwhile supporter of expanding slavery, was concerned about the morals and ethics of the War of Mexico. And this was a war that would haunt Americans for generations to come. For example, Ulysses S. Grant, who would be a general in the US Army during the Civil War, later President of the United States, wrote in his memoirs, arguably the best memoirs ever written by any US president, that the War of Mexico was basically a moral stain on the country. And he actually even argues that we deserved the tragedy and the bloodshed of the Civil War because of the War of Mexico. Now, the problem with the War with Mexico is that it introduces a lot of new territory to the United States. And very quickly, politicians in Washington, D.C. argue over whether or not that territory should be slave or free territory. And this is really what drives some of the political polarization in the 1850s, as this question of slave and free territory turns to slave and free states. Most Americans, North and South, begin to polarize around the issue of slavery. And again, this has really deleterious impacts on American politics. This political cartoon shows an example of this. This is from around 1854 or so. This is after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was signed into law by the US Congress. Now, that particular act followed the Compromise of 1850. And again, I'm doing a lot of summarizing here for the sake of time and brevity. But both of these acts were designed to stave off the potential of civil war down the road by setting certain guidelines for which territories and which states would be slave and free territories from here on out. By 1854, the idea of popular sovereignty becomes very popular across the country. Basically, the idea was we will allow the territories to decide for themselves whether they'll be slave territory or free territory, believing that small d democracy was the best way forward. Before this, Congress had decided which territories would be slave and free, primarily by their position on the continent. For example, any territory south of, say, the border of Missouri would be slave territory. Anything north of that would be free territory. That, of course, was an outcome of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. By 1854, however, Congress is running out of compromises. And again, this cartoon shows what the politics of the day thought about slavery in the North. You see here, this man is being held down by Southern politicians. It says, "Murder, help, neighbors, help. Oh, my poor wife and children." You see an enslaved person being literally shoved down his throat. And it says, "Forcing slavery down the throat of a free soil." However, the most important part of this cartoon might not be that. It might be this in the shadows over here. Now, you recall on the Modjeska School website, there is a link to an interview with Matt Karp, a historian who studies the South's influence on US foreign policy in the 19th century. And he points out that slave owners in the South, especially those who were involved in politics, had plans to expand slavery beyond America's borders. They wanted to take parts of Mexico, Central America, purchase Cuba, and take other islands in the Caribbean Sea as well, to expand slavery there too. And if you look at this cartoon, you see this in action. This says here, Democratic platform. The Democratic Party was running on during that decade's presidential elections. And you see Kansas is in the light. Kansas is a place where they want to expand slavery too, but in the dark, in the shadows, is Cuba and Central America. And many historians are now pretty certain that if the Confederacy had been victorious in the Civil War, one of their first acts would have been to purchase Cuba from Spain in order to expand slavery there. You have to remember, one of the things that slave owners in South Carolina and across the South are thinking about is for slavery to succeed and for slavery to stay entrenched, it has to grow. It needs new territories. It needs new lands where we can grow cash crops like cotton. Again, we saw this in action in South Carolina. As more and more arable land in this state is basically used up for the sake of growing cotton and other cash crops, many of those planters are purchasing land out west, trying to expand slavery there. One of their big fears is that at a certain point, as large as the United States is, there is only so much land for them to use. And their long-term goal is to find new and inventive ways to expand slavery, even if it means risking war with other countries, even if it means purchasing territory in the Caribbean and in Central America. Now, closer to home, the tensions over slavery threaten to implode the Union. One good example of this is the caning of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks. So, make a long story short, Senator Sumner was giving a speech on the floor of the Senate where he really denigrates the Southern institution of slavery. And among other things, he criticizes the politicians from South Carolina, including, memory serves, our good friend, Senator James Hammond. Now, Brooks was related to Hammond. He was a cousin of his, and he was outraged by what Sumner had said about the good senator from South Carolina. Now, let me take a step back for a moment. In the 19th century, the idea of honor was an integral part of Southern society. And I'm not talking about like honor like the Klingons in Star Trek. I mean, a certain kind of honor where you would handle things a certain way depending on your class, depending on your position within that class. And Brooks, at least in theory, should have seen Sumner as an equal. And if he had, he would have done the civilized thing and challenged him to a duel, which was something a lot of folks did back then. However, Brooks was so outraged by Sumner's words that instead of challenging him to a duel like a true gentleman, he went to Sumner's desk on the floor of the Senate, told Sumner who he was, and then hit him upside the head with a cane. Not once, not twice, a few dozen times, attacking Sumner so viciously that Sumner was out of the Senate for close to 2 years, recovering from his injuries. Now, the full cartoon here actually says at the bottom, Southern chivalry, argument versus clubs. And this was from a Northern newspaper. But in the aftermath of the caning of Charles Sumner, many Northerners, even those who were unaffiliated with the anti-slavery cause or with abolition, were outraged that a senator could be beaten on the floor of the Senate and nothing would happen to his assailant. On the other hand, in the South, Preston Brooks was so praised by many other Southerners that dozens, if not hundreds of canes were sent to his office in Washington as a token of their support. But putting all the jokes aside for a second, this really shows how bad things have gotten. Now, granted, it is worth considering too that the US House and Senate were not the places of august debate they are today. In the 19th century, there were numerous stories of senators and congressmen bringing weapons to the floor of the House and Senate. It was a rather raucous place, and one wishes we had C-SPAN back then to see it all. But in the 1850s, Americans are saying, hey, this is starting to kind of get out of control now. We have fighting on the floor of Congress. Of course, by 1856, we also have actual warfare in Kansas because of the fact that Kansas is trying to vote on whether or not it'll be a free state or a slave state. Again, this idea of popular sovereignty coming back into play. Now, when popular sovereignty was first proposed, the idea behind it made sense. Politicians believed Americans would only move to places that fit their economic and social needs. So Southerners and slaveholders would go to places that were amenable for slavery, and Northerners and free soilers would go to places that were not amenable for slavery, but were amenable for small-time farming. However, Kansas did not neatly fit into either category. It was a place where slaveholders wanted to plant their flag and to say, we are going to stay here permanently and establish the state as a slave state. Many abolitionists from across the country also moved to Kansas, the desire being to vote in the elections in Kansas to make it a free state. This, of course, turns into full-scale violence, including, of course, John Brown leading men against pro-slavery advocates in Kansas. Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas in the late 1850s because of the sheer amount of violence there. Now, an important way of thinking about the era leading up to the American Civil War is that each branch of the federal government tried to find a way to solve the issue of slavery and utterly failed to do so. The presidents of this era, who are often largely forgotten, certainly did not do a good job of dealing with slavery. Congress kept kicking the can down the road with compromise after compromise in an attempt to stave off a final answer for the slavery question. But in 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States, under Chief Justice Roger Taney, decided that it had the authority to solve the slavery issue once and for all. And if there's one thing we know from both history and contemporary events, is that the Supreme Court never gets anything wrong when it comes to politics and the current condition of the American state. I, of course, mean that tongue in cheek. Actually, the Supreme Court has more often gotten it wrong than has gotten it right, but we'll learn more about that later this semester. In 1857, the Dred Scott v. Sanford case finally reaches the Supreme Court, a case that had been working its way through the federal court system since the late 1840s. The owners of Dred and Harriet Scott, people you see here on the screen, had taken them to Wisconsin territory. Now, Wisconsin was free territory, and the Scots were told by local abolitionists, hey, you're on free soil, you're free, you should sue for your freedom in the federal court. Now, up until 1857, most Americans had conceded that territories in what was known as the Northwest Territory, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, so on and so forth, the modern Midwest, when that territory was first allotted by the federal government under the Constitution, it was all deemed free territory. And as those states entered the Union, they entered as free states. However, Southerners had long chafed under the idea that they could not take their property with them as they pleased. And again, remember, the Southerners viewed the enslaved not as people, but as property. And this was a nationwide problem. You think about, for instance, Southerners who were going to university in, say, Princeton or Rutgers in New Jersey. This was actually a serious problem where they would bring their enslaved people with them to those colleges. And the colleges they would basically say, okay, well, this is your tradition, even though you're in a free state, we'll let you keep your slaves. This has actually become a part of the modern debate over reparations from universities, that the northern universities often allowed the enslaved to be brought to those places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Rutgers, and so forth. Even the president was not immune from these issues. The first president of the United States, George Washington, spent most of his presidency either in Philadelphia or New York before Washington, D.C. was constructed. And especially during his time in Philadelphia in the 1790s, he was well aware of a law that allowed for the enslaved to basically gain their freedom if they were in Philadelphia more than 6 months at a time. What President Washington would do is he would actually rotate his slaves out of Philadelphia right around May. So they leave by June, be back in Virginia, start the rotation process over again. Ona Judge is actually his most famous enslaved person. She actually escaped from Washington during his presidency, and he spent the rest of his life trying to capture her. even utilizing the resources of the federal government to do so, but never actually catching her. He even tries to negotiate with her through intermediary, and she simply says, "I'd much rather die poor and a pauper than live in slavery." But let's get back to Dred Scott for a second. Again, Dred and Harriet Scott sued for their freedom. Many abolitionists assume they'll receive it. But when the case reaches the Supreme Court, Judge Roger Taney decides to go well beyond the mandates of the actual case, deciding their freedom, and decides this is the moment we can solve the slavery issue once and for all. Taney hands down what is considered by many legal scholars, even originalists, as the worst Supreme Court decision in history. In the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, Taney and his compatriots ruled the following things. Number one, the Scots were still enslaved. They could not receive their freedom even being on free soil. And that's because of the second and perhaps more important argument. Taney argued in his majority opinion that people of African descent had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote, within the United States. In essence, if you were Black in America, whether you were enslaved in Charleston or free in Philadelphia, you weren't a citizen. And so your livelihood as a citizen of this country was always in doubt and always in peril. Now, when we get to Reconstruction, this will become all the more important because it will help to explain why we have a 14th Amendment in the first place. Because the idea of citizenship was not nationally established until after the Civil War. And for Black Americans in particular, this was very important because if you don't have citizenship, you can't vote, you can't serve on juries. And what Taney is saying is if you were Black in America in 1857, no matter where you were in the country, you didn't have any rights whatsoever. Now, many white Northerners are outraged by this decision. Again, not because of any love for Negroes, but because they saw where this was headed. That the Taney court basically said the entire country is open to slavery. Anyone could bring their slaves anywhere in the country at any time. And according to the Supreme Court, the Constitution guaranteed that right. Northern public opinion on the issue of slavery firmly and decisively takes a turn against the institution, not so much in terms of ending it in the South, but certainly in stopping it from spreading further west. And I see someone has actually put in the chat a link to the Own a Judge book. Thank you so much for doing that. It is a great book called Never Caught. I highly recommend. Now, by the end of the 1850s, abolitionists are having some really serious and often frustrating debates about what is to be done when it came to the institution of slavery. After the Dred Scott decision, some abolitionists were beginning to believe that there was no real solution, at least legal, that could end slavery. At the very least, the Constitution would require some sort of massive change to it to destroy slavery as they knew it. Others, like John Brown, began to entertain the idea of fomenting some sort of slave revolt in the South that could finally break the back of slavery itself. Now, last week, I spent a lot of time talking about the German Coast Rebellion, then Mark Vesey's rebellion, the Haitian Revolution, because I wanted to make it clear that the idea, the threat to some and the dream to others of a slave revolt was not as far-fetched as we might think. The desire to be free yearned within the spirit of every enslaved person in the United States. It was only a question of how to use that flame of freedom to actually become real freedom in the process. Brown thought it would be a good idea to give the slaves weapons. Now, before the Harper's Ferry raid, Brown discusses his ideas with two important and legendary abolitionists, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Now, Douglass, he likes Brown's sentiment. He says that's good heart, good spirit, but Douglas has his doubts. And he's unsure of the idea of attacking a federal arsenal in Virginia and trying to get weapons to the enslaved. He has his doubts. He's not really sure about it, and he declines to join the expedition. Harriet Tubman, however, is more than game to do. She was down for the cause. Unfortunately, she gets sick right before the raid happens, so she cannot join John Brown in his quest. Now, obviously, if you hear the sort of clash, you know how this turns out. Not well for Brown and his associates. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry is basically a disaster. They raid the arsenal, they take some hostages, but they are eventually surrounded by a detachment of U.S. Marines, funny enough, who were led by a Colonel Robert E. Lee. And they find themselves trapped in the arsenal and are eventually forced to surrender. Now, again, Brown and several of his men are executed by the state of Virginia for trying to foment a slave revolt. And as we heard at the start of class this evening, Brown's last words to the state of Virginia and to the entire world were indicative of how he believed that the institution of slavery at this point had reached a point of no return. Either it would continue in perpetuity or it would be destroyed through blood and fire. It was as simple as that. So the following year, the nation has a presidential election. Now, I know that we have become very used to hearing every 4 years. This is the most important election of your lifetimes. I've heard that every time since I think 2000, 2000 basically. I've heard it every 4 years. I've been voting since 2004. After a while, it starts to lose its luster of it's the most important election in your lifetime. But in this case, in 1860, everyone North and South knew you better get this right or else. Now, by 1860, a new party, the Republican Party, had been around for only about 6 years. It was formed in Wisconsin, and it was an attempt to unite the disparate members of the Democratic Party, the old Whig Party, anti-slavery agitators, abolitionists, so on and so forth, under one banner. Because of that, the Republican Party was not a true national party. It was really a party that only competed in the North, and as you see out west in California and Oregon as well. However, the National Party, Democratic Party, found itself bitterly divided over the issue of slavery. In their infinite wisdom, they decided to have their convention in Charleston in 1860, and it turns into an unmitigated disaster. Northern and Southern Democrats cannot agree on slavery any longer. Some Northern Democrats support slavery, but only want to go so far. Whereas in the South, slavery has become the test of your loyalty, not to the party, but to the South. Recall last week I mentioned that John C. Calhoun gave up national aspirations to prove his loyalty to South Carolina. Now you're seeing this on a regional level, where many Southern politicians are saying, I am loyal to the US government, but the South and its interests must come first. As a result, the Democratic Party also splits in several different directions. And by that fall's election, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency with only 40% of the popular vote. But I think you can see from the map how he's able to win. And this is actually what many Southerners were afraid of for generations. Now, up until 1860, the two major parties, whether they were Democratic Republicans and Federalists or Whigs and Democrats, they had always competed in both the North and the South. And many politicians believed this was good for the country. It meant that sectional interests would never overwhelm national concerns. Well, in 1860, that's a bit different. White Northerners vote for Lincoln because they want to stop the expansion of slavery in what remains of Western territory, like Nebraska, Mexico, Utah, etc. Many Southerners, meanwhile, are much more determined than ever before to defend slavery. And as the election results come in, November of 1860, many Southerners began to wonder what their next course of action should be.
I'm sorry, before you move on.
Yes.
I can't see the numbers. Was it because of the electoral college that Lincoln won?
Yes, exactly. The good old electoral college. I mean, again, this is a thing that Southern leaders were afraid of for a long time. And let's go back to last week in the Constitution for a second. The whole reason for the 3/5 compromise was to give the South just enough electoral power to where they wouldn't feel entirely threatened by the larger population of the North. But what happens is that in 1860, the North votes for one candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Now, a bunch of these states are actually pretty close. In the chat, somebody notes that New Jersey is split. There's actually a good reason for this. New Jersey was one of those states that a lot of this votes a little bit differently. Each state had the authority to allot its electoral college votes the way they saw fit. So most states did it by popular vote. Some of them legislature. You may have also had a faithless elector who may have decided to go rogue and vote for somebody else. That happened a lot in the 19th century. But on the whole, Lincoln is able to win enough electoral college votes just from campaigning in the North that he wins the election. Keep in mind, Lincoln not only did not campaign in the South, he was not even on the ballot in the South. The Republican Party was not on the ballot anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line, and they still won. So, and again, you look at the map here too, you see the South isn't even like united. Like the Deep South votes for Breckinridge, but the Upper South, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee vote for John Bell, who's the leader of the Constitutional Union Party. And that party is a third party that basically runs on the platform of, let's just all stick together. Can't we all just get along? That is the platform. There's nothing else to it. It's just, let's avoid a civil war, and that only wins 3 states. Now, quickly after the election results come in, South Carolina begins hosting a series of debates and a convention to decide whether or not to secede from the Union. And of course, I think many folks have seen this image of the Charleston Mercury, which was a ardently pro-secession newspaper. It says the Union is dissolved. Okay, we always see this image, right? But I want to get into why the state left the Union. Now, when I was a kid in elementary school, in the old days of the 1990s, I made that joke because my students were born after 9/11, so I feel even older than usual. But when I was growing up in Georgia, the caveat there, I was initially taught that the war was about slavery. I learned that first. And then I learned it was about states' rights. And then I learned again it was about slavery. And then by high school, as we were having a debate in Georgia about getting rid of the Confederate battle emblem on our state flag, this debate really blew up about what the war was actually about. Now, at home, my parents always taught me the war was about slavery. And amongst Black Americans especially, there is a long tradition of teaching a counter history to the standard narrative in schools. For instance, you think about a place like Claflin, where I work at, or Booker T. Washington High School in Columbia. All these Black-run institutions taught their students about slavery, about the cause of war being slavery, and so forth. The problem was that the majority of Americans believed what was in textbooks like those of the Sims History of South Carolina that taught that states' rights, this vague idea, was the cause of the Civil War. In fact, the Sims textbook actually blames, like we already heard, abolitionists for the war. I want to read you again what she argues is the actual cause of the Civil War. So let's see. Okay. Now, this is, again, I think, really important to understand. This is what she wrote on page 200 of the book. Under Unit 5, the Confederate War and Reconstruction. You have seen how the North and the South grew farther and farther apart in disputes over the tariff and slavery. You have also learned that South Carolina, to protect its rights, seceded from the Union. 10 other Southern states, following South Carolina's example, left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The North held that the Southern states had no right to secede and sent its blue-clad soldiers to force them back into the Union. Confederate soldiers wearing gray uniforms fearlessly faced the blue armies. The struggle began in South Carolina when Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor was taken from the federal troops which garrisoned it. During the 4 years of the Confederate War, the United States made several unsuccessful attempts to take Charleston, both by land and by sea. South Carolina soldiers fought with the Confederate armies in Virginia and the West. They fought gallantly against heavy odds. A wide strip through the heart of our state was finally laid waste by General Sherman's army. Outnumbered and starved, the Confederate soldiers at last gave up in 1865 the unequal struggle against the United States. Now, this is how the Civil War was normally portrayed in textbooks in South Carolina throughout the 20th century. And some of that actually is accurate. It is worth noting, especially the ideas of South Carolina leaving the Union to defend its rights, but its rights to do what? Let's take a look at the actual secession ordinance. And I apologize for this like big blob of text here, but I always notice to my students at Claflin, because it's one thing to be told what the war is about, it's nothing to see for your own eyes what it was about. So I'm going to actually read this and try not to pass out in the process. But what they're referring to here is how they felt the federal government failed to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and fugitive slave laws in the books, including in the Constitution. So listen very carefully. The general government, federal government, asked a common agent pass laws to carry into effect these stipulations of the states. Again, the idea that the federal government had the authority to capture fugitive slaves and bring them back south. For many years, these laws were executed, but an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states, the North, to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. So they actually note examples of northern states violating the Constitution. They say, in the state of New York, even the right of transit for a slave has been denied by her tribunals, and the states of Ohio and Iowa have refused to surrender to justice fugitives charged with murder and with inciting servile insurrection in the state of Virginia. Now, by 1860, you're starting to see more and more northern states and cities basically saying they aren't going to enforce any fugitive slave laws whatsoever. They're not going to let U.S. Marshals into town. They're not going to let the U.S. government capture these folks. Again, it's a mixed bag. In New York, for example, you do have cases where the New York officials are helping U.S. Marshals capture slaves, depending on what part of the state you're in. In Boston, this was impossible. In Boston, you cannot get any fugitive slaves out of there and back to the South. It was impossible. There's even a story of Frederick Douglass giving a speech when he was still a fugitive slave in the 1840s, I believe in Massachusetts. And the U.S. Marshals are literally right outside the church that he's giving a speech in. The abolitionists block the doors, they get Douglass out through the back, and he goes to England for several years. He gives a speaking tour there while the abolitionists raise money to purchase his freedom. By 1860, the fugitive slave system has fallen apart for the most part. And so South Carolina argues that their rights to hold slaves are being imperiled. And they say, thus, the constituted compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slave holding states. And the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligation. In essence, they're saying, if they want to abide by the Constitution, why should we? Now, Now I'm going to get into constitutional theory, my apologies, but this is important to understand. In the 19th century, there were two trains of thought about how the Constitution worked. One was what South Carolina is saying. They're saying it was a compact between independent and free states that was signed in 1787. They're arguing they have a right to leave that compact at any moment. On the other side were folks like Abraham Lincoln, who argued once the Constitution was signed and ratified, that was it. You were in the Constitution, you were in a federal union, whether you liked it or not. And in fact, they even argued that the very way the Constitution was written, starting with "we the people," right, says that the compact between the states supersedes any independent state attempt to leave the union. Now, South Carolina leaves the union, and soon afterward, they began to send agents across the South to speak to other state governments, other state conventions, to convince them to leave the union. Now, there is a wonderful book that I want to recommend right now, and it's called Apostles of Disunion, and I'm putting it in the chat right now, by Charles Dew. Apostles of Disunion is a very short book, but it is a very important book. And it was released in 2001 because Dew, who was, for the record, he was a Southern historian, he was an older man, and he had grown tired of the debates in both Georgia and South Carolina about the Confederate flag that he felt were ahistorical. He had grown tired of folks saying the war is about states' rights. And so he writes, the book is like 100 pages long. It's a very short book. But basically what it shows is that these agents that go across the South fomenting secession are doing so by arguing that they must defend slavery and defend the growth of slavery. And in order to do that, they must secede from the Union. Like, it is clear as day when you read that book what they're talking about in there. And not just slavery, they're also talking about a particular form of slavery that is supported by ideas and precepts of white supremacy, where they're saying Negroes not only make good slaves, that is what they are fit to do, and only that alone. So South Carolina leaves the Union in December of 1860, and in the following 3 months, known as Secession Winter, several other Southern states joined them as well. Okay, so before I go on to the Civil War, any questions about secession? Yes, go ahead.
This may seem so naive and ignorant, so I apologize.
No, go
But
ahead.
is there something about South Carolina that really specifically set them apart from those other states that made them the first ones to go down this route?
That is not a bad question. That's actually a very smart question. And it's one that folks in this state have been grappling with for over 200 years. Yes, to your question, yes. The short answer is yes. The long answer is this. You have to remember that South Carolina's very purpose of existence from its colonization onward was for the expansion of slavery. This makes it different from every other American state, even other Southern states. That, from the beginning, changes how the politics of this state work as a colony under Great Britain, as a state within the United States. And by 1860 and 61, this ideology has continued to fester in the state for decades. So, for example, let's go back to last week for a second. When you have the debate over the tariff in 1832, Calhoun himself acknowledges this debate is not really about the tariff. It's about defending slavery. But at that time, South Carolina was seen as so out of the mainstream, even with the rest of the South, that no other state would support it. The difference between 1860 and 1832 is that by 1860, South Carolina has basically convinced the rest of the South to be more like them, to do anything and everything it must do to defend slavery. This state was, for all intents and purposes, the birthplace of the Fire Eater movement. That was an ardently pro-slavery movement that was not only against abolitionism, it was against any attempts to restrict slavery. And what you see during the 19th century is that the fire eaters moved from being on the fringes of Southern politics to being in the mainstream by 1860. And again, that process begins in South Carolina. South Carolina cannot see its livelihood as separated from the institution of slavery. It must defend slavery at all costs. And again, other Southern states may also believe this to varying degrees. What makes South Carolina so different is that A, it was founded for the purpose of slavery, and B, all of its major leaders, your John C. Calhouns, the Lawrence folks, let's see who else, so many others within the state, John Henry Hammond, et cetera. They are all coming at this from an ideology of we must defend slavery at all costs. We have to. They're seeing slavery as not just a way of life, but as life itself. And that's what makes the state so different. And I think that's what explains how the state remains a center of white supremacist ideology up to today. Did I answer your question?
Dr. Greene, if I may.
Oh, please go ahead.
Kim's question is something that the nub of my biscuit in considering that question is South Carolina is the only colony in this, starting from the 1500s to 1600s up to the 1700s that wasn't started from the mother country. The Lord Proprietors actually gave up on the Southern Carolina and said, y'all take it. And the Barbadians moved in, and they'd already been in Barbados. The young Barbadians who grew up there, they'd been in Barbados for 80 years with a brutal slavery economy growing sugar. And there's only so much land in Barbados. So when your kids grew up, they're looking around, well, what can we do? Well, there's nothing happening in South Carolina. And so literally the Barbadian influence, they were the first governors. They took over the state. And that is so bred in the bone, as Modjeska would say, it can't be beat out of the flesh. Thank you, Dr. Greene.
Oh, no, thank you. And I see in the chat, there's a question from Randall as well. If there were no Dred Scott decision, would that fact nullify the SC secession statement? That's a good question. I think, I often ask my students, when do you think the Civil War is inevitable? And many of them argue that it's Dred Scott. From that point on, a civil war was going to happen because of how the Supreme Court decision overrode the Northern states' rights. If there was no Dred Scott decision, or if it was like a really narrow decision just about the Scots, at best, it may have staved off the Civil War for a few years, but I think by 1857, the conditions were already there for a conflict over slavery. If not in 1860, probably by 1864, 1868. It's difficult to say for sure, but what we do know is what we got, which is a civil war in 1861, which is what we're going to go to next.
Dr. Greene, while
Yes.
you're going, the book that Dr. Greene lifted up there, Martha Monteith, Modjeska's sister-in-law, gave me that book. That's a book that Modjeska, not that particular book, that's 30-something. She refused to use that book when she was teaching high school at Booker T in the 20s. The latest edition of that book that was started as the official textbook of South Carolina in 1840, the last edition of the South Carolina official history was 1977. So every politician over figured it out quickly. Some certain age, that's the book they had for the last 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a
Exactly.
mistake.
They weren't teaching it that way in Detroit by any means. That's so crazy.
Now, I think, again, I've mentioned the Sims book a few times this evening. As we transition and talking about the Civil War era, I want to invoke a different book. Now, the Sims history book that we have here was published in 1932. By 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois, 70 years old, had written, just around 70 years old, had written Black Reconstruction, an essay toward a history of the part which Black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. Now, I've read from the Sims book, but as a palate cleanser, I want to read from the Du Bois book just for a quick second. This is actually from the foreword called To the Reader. This is what Du Bois wrote. This is the first thing you see when you open the book. It would only be fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person for this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes that the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts I have set down. But this latter person, I am not trying to convince. I am simply pointing out these 2 points of view, so obvious to Americans. And then without further ado, I am assuming the truth of the first. And fine, I am going to tell this story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, realizing that this attitude will from the first seriously curtail my audience. That was W.E. Burghardt Du Bois, Atlanta, Georgia, December 1934. Now, I invoke that for 2 reasons. Number one, again, to offset the Sims history, remember that as the Sims book becomes so popular, there are Black historians pushing back against it, like Du Bois, like Carter G. Woodson, like so many others. But secondly, I want to mention that now because the narrative about Civil War and Reconstruction you're going to hear this evening is heavily influenced by Du Bois. And I would argue that any historian you read about the Civil War era, whether it's your James McPherson's or your Eric Foners or anyone else who has been writing about the Civil War in the last 50 years or so, they are in some way influenced by Du Bois's landmark scholarship. Now, the drawing I have on the screen here is a rather famous one that shows, in many ways, the fruits of the Reconstruction era. It shows a group of Black Americans having a political rally. This could be in Florida, could be in Mississippi, could be in Georgia, could be right here in South Carolina. Could be Orangeburg, could be Columbia, could be Lawrence County. Who knows? But as I look at this image and think about the history it invokes, what I always look at, not the man politicking right here, it's not even the women who are listening off in the background. This is young boy right here. I always look at him because I think to myself, this is the only person in this audience who is going to have a life that will be spent more free than enslaved. And in many ways, this lecture is about his experience as it is about everyone else's. He represents the future that we all desperately fight for. Now, the future that many white South Carolinians fought for would not have included him unless he was enslaved. As many as 60,000 white South Carolinians served in the war for the Confederacy. And if memory serves, this is the largest proportion of population to serve out of any Southern state during the war. Over 12,000 are killed during the course of the conflict, which is a pretty stark ratio for any one state to endure. Only about 791 South Carolinians seek exemptions during the war. Again, if you own a certain number of slaves, for example, you get an exemption from the war, had a certain amount of wealth, get an exemption. Even many wealthy South Carolinians believed it was worth fighting for and dying for in this conflict. Now, of course, the war begins in South Carolina with the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861. By that point, numerous Southern states had left the Union, and a new president, Abraham Lincoln, was trying to find a way to, in essence, let the war happen and blame the Confederacy for it. And the firing on Fort Sumter was his chance to do just that. Once Fort Sumter is fired upon, Lincoln is able to issue a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he called the rebellion in the South. The language is important. Lincoln never once in his presidency acknowledged the Confederacy as a separate government. He always couched it in terms of a regional insurrection against loyal governments to the Union. Now, of course, the war begins in South Carolina, but one can make the argument that Reconstruction also begins in South Carolina the same year. Now, the Sims book does make mention of numerous attempts by the federal troops to take Charleston, to attack the coastline. And in November of 1861, as you see portrayed in this painting here, Union forces do attack the Port Royal area of South Carolina. And this is a map of it in case you're not familiar with where Port Royal is. It is just to the south of Charleston and to Beaufort and just north of Savannah. But when federal troops land in Port Royal, what they quickly realized is that the slaveholders who were in the area had fled further inland, leaving behind thousands of enslaved people. Or were they formerly enslaved? No one actually knew, because in 1861, the government had not exactly developed a policy on enslaved people who were behind or who had been brought from enemy lines to federal lines. Were they slave? Were they free? Depending who you asked. The president had not yet built a policy of this for one very simple reason. He was afraid of losing border states like Kentucky and especially Maryland that were still pro-slavery, but had decided in Maryland's case to stay in the Union, case of Kentucky to stay somehow neutral in the Civil War. Some federal generals, when they came upon enslaved Africans, gave them their freedom. They said, if you'll work for us, if you'll cook food for our troops, do their laundry, you'll have your freedom. In other cases, early on in the war at least, you have federal troops actually taking the time to return former slaves to their owners early on in the war, because they were still respecting the Constitution. But Port Royal was a new challenge. There were thousands of enslaved people in the area, and the federal officials there really had no idea what to do. So they said, well, okay, let's go ahead, let them work for themselves. This is actually a pretty big deal. The Port Royal experiment, as it becomes known, is really a test of whether formerly enslaved Africans will do this weird thing called work for themselves. I mean, I know it sounds facetious like a joke, but I'm joking at being serious at the same time. Many white Northerners, even some abolitionists, thought, well, we don't like slavery, we don't want to expand, but we also believe Africans are naturally lazy. Now, I'm going to say that again. Some of them thought that Africans were naturally lazy, despite having, I don't know, about 300 years of evidence to the contrary at this point. But what the Port Royal experiment showed was that not only were formerly enslaved Africans, Black Americans, willing to work for themselves, they had their own thoughts about what freedom would actually look like. And again, this was a revelation to many white Northerners who assumed that Black Americans had no thoughts, no feelings, no emotions, nothing of human value. And yet the soldiers who worked with the formerly enslaved folks in Port Royal realized they had their own dreams of land ownership, their own dreams of learning how to read and write. In short, they dreamed of a future where Black people actually had a future. And in 1861, this was an especially radical idea, made doubly so by the fact that this was in South Carolina. Now, for the next couple of years, school teachers will be brought in from New England to teach the formerly enslaved how to read and write. And at the same time, many New Englanders came down to teach the formerly enslaved the ideas about capitalism and free market economics. Now, the Black Americans living in Port Royal were, shall we say, a bit skeptical about some of these ideas. For many of them, sorry about that. for many of them, their most important idea was the idea of independence, of being able to live off the land on their own, of having their own schools, their own churches, their own institutions. The Port Royal experiment became known to history as proof positive that some idea of the formerly enslaved working and living for themselves and their families was not actually unfeasible, but could actually be practically done. The question remained, however, would Black Americans be allowed to chart their own destiny, or would it be under the ideas of free market economics and capitalism? This, again, becomes a serious issue during the Reconstruction period. Now, we'll come back to Port Royal, but as the war goes on throughout the Confederacy, what begins to happen is that the federal government takes a second look at using Black soldiers. Now, when the war begins, both North and South are adamant in saying that this is a white man's war. However, by late 1862, especially to President Lincoln's administration, it's becoming quite clear. And this war is going to need a lot more than 75,000 volunteers. Both North and South institute a draft system during the war. The North, by the end of 1862, begins using Black soldiers. Now, if you've seen the film Glory, then you see the best known regiment of Black soldiers in the war, the 54th Massachusetts from the state of Massachusetts. However, if you watch the film closely, you may remember when they get to South Carolina, they encounter other Black soldiers. And the film's kind of funny about this because it'll tell you where they came from, but just already there. Those were the first South Carolina volunteers, arguably the first Black unit formed in the Civil War. Many of them were former slaves from Florida and South Carolina. And in fact, if you watch the film Glory, one of the soldiers is speaking with a clear Gullah Geechee accent to the point where I think it's Andre Braugher's character cannot understand him. He's like, what did you just say? Yeah, the film doesn't really delve into this too deeply, which is unfortunate. But that part of the film is based off a great book called Army Life in a Black Regiment by Thomas Hensworth Wigginson, who was a federal officer in the Army who led Black soldiers during the Civil War. Now, the first South Carolina volunteers I often mention as an example of how can we put this? Not every person in the South fought for the Confederacy. I think that's pretty important to note, especially as we have more and more debates about Confederate monuments and statues. There are many white Southerners today who argue that's part of their heritage. However, I would also argue things like the Battle of Fort Wagner are also part of their heritage as well, fought in this state in 1863. Again, the battle portrayed at the end of the film Glory. Now, this battle was pivotal to proving to many white Northerners that Blacks would fight for the Union and would fight for freedom. This fight for freedom is not one that was just a metaphor or not just theoretical for many of these soldiers. By the end of the Civil War, over 200,000 Black Americans served in the Federal Army and Navy. Many of them quite literally fighting for the freedom of their wives, their children, their fathers, their mothers, their aunts and uncles. One could make the case that no American army fought for a more literal idea of freedom than these Black men who fought in the Civil War. But it's also worth mentioning that over 100,000 white Southerners fought for the federal government as well. Another fact that's often forgotten about in debates about Confederate statues. For example, I often wonder, where is the statue to General George Thomas? Anybody heard of George Thomas? Anybody else? There's a good reason you haven't heard of George Thomas. George Thomas led Black troops into combat in the Battle of Nashville in 1864. He was also from Virginia. Unlike Robert E. Lee, Thomas actually remembered his oath to the Constitution and fought for the federal government and was ostracized in the South for decades after. He and thousands of other white Southerners from, for example, the mountains of Western North Carolina to West Virginia to East Tennessee, Alabama, all throughout the South, fought for the federal government in the Civil War. In fact, only one state in the South did not raise a federal regiment to fight in the war: South Carolina. Every other Southern state had at least one regiment that fought for the federal government, but not South Carolina. So again, to your question about the state, what makes it unique, I think that's kind of proof of how unique the state actually was. But the idea of a belief in a confederacy and a belief in the Southern way of life was seriously threatened during the Civil War, really by two groups of people. Number one are poor whites, many of whom found themselves fighting a war for slavery for an institution that they themselves never actually joined into. They couldn't purchase any slaves, couldn't afford it. Yet they found themselves fighting for leaders of the Confederacy who owned plenty of slaves and so to make much more money after the war if they won it. Desertion rates for Confederate units were, especially in the last few years of the war, quite high. Many Confederate soldiers quite simply walked away from the battlefront and went home. And the problem became so severe that the Confederacy had to utilize basically units of hunters to find deserters as they left to go back home. Now, one cannot note the irony of the fact that the system that was once used to capture fugitive slaves was now being used to capture other white Southerners. This painting actually portrays a food riot in Alabama around 1863 or 64. As the Confederate war effort drags on, Confederate states start to see shortages in food, in clothing. Everything becomes very expensive. The Confederacy itself is cut off from most of the rest of the world thanks to a federal blockade. And remember, so much of Southern land that could have been used for farming for food was being used to grow cotton. And so as Charleston and Savannah Harbor were covered with hundreds of bales of cotton that couldn't be sold anywhere else, folks in those states were also starving to death because of the Civil War and its aftermath. However, a second major threat to the Confederacy, at least internally, was from the enslaved themselves. Now, the last couple of weeks, we've talked at great length about how so much of the Southern way of life, especially in South Carolina, was shaped by the institution of slavery, in particular, how their governments worked, how patrol systems worked to keep the slaves in line, how everything was designed to keep slavery running as smoothly as possible and to avoid a slave revolt. That system collapsed during the Civil War. Out of 4 million men, women, and children who were enslaved in 1860, by 1865, at least 500,000 of them gained their freedom, whether it was fleeing to federal lines, whether it was simply walk away from their plantation. The chaos of the war itself gave the enslaved their greatest opportunity yet for freedom, especially once President Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation that goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. Now, I know that most historians today emphasize the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the enslaved behind Confederate lines. That's true. Again, the proclamation reads that if the enslaved in the Confederacy were not freed by January 1st, 1863, they were considered henceforth and forever free. However, the proclamation fundamentally changed what the war was about. Up until January 1st, 1863, most white Northerners had convinced themselves, in vain, really, that the war was not about slavery. It was about restoring the Union, defending democracy. And those things were certainly true and were important enough to fight for. But the enslaved themselves from the get-go knew what the war was really about, which explains how from the beginning of the conflict, you have first few individual, then a dozen, and a few hundred, and a few thousand, and tens of thousands of enslaved people going towards federal lines. If they heard there were federal troops in the area, troops clad in the blue uniforms, that's who they went to. But in some cases, federal troops came to them, which brings me to the Combahee River Raid in 1863. That happened right here in South Carolina. Now, again, we're going back to our good friend Harriet Tubman, who, as I said before, was down for the cause. By 1863, Tubman has gone from being a conductor on the Underground Railroad to actually working as a spy and an agent for the federal government. In fact, she is believed to be the first woman to essentially serve openly in the U.S. military on an operation in combat, which is the Combahee River Raid, where Black federal troops were sent into South Carolina to free several hundred enslaved people at one time. It was basically an anti-slavery raid that was wildly successful. But this raid showed how vulnerable slavery was to the Civil War. I mentioned earlier W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. One of the major arguments of his book is that the Civil War era is best described as a general strike by enslaved Africans, that they were taking upon themselves the opportunity to disrupt and destroy the Southern economy by doing things as simple as breaking tools, as working slower, as not working at all. And in the case of 500,000 people leaving the institution behind. Now, Du Bois is one of the first historians to make this argument that the war was not only about slavery, but was decided by the enslaved themselves. He centered those Black men and women in this history. And certainly, by 1865, when General Sherman's dastardly troops enter South Carolina, it's quite clear the war is not only over, but that slavery's days are numbered. Now, as a native Georgian, I grew up learning about Sherman's March to the Sea, and I was always taught it was the worst that ever happened in the state of Georgia. But we also often conveniently left out that it was far worse for South Carolina. We always emphasize Atlanta being burned and rising like a phoenix, and then Sherman and his army just disappeared in history. Obviously, that wasn't the case. When they make it to Savannah, they soon turn north. And this is where some federal troops had some fun. Again, many in the North utterly hated South Carolina by 1865. They blamed this state, I think understandably, for the Civil War. They said the 800,000 men who died in this war would not have died if not for those fools in South Carolina. And so they decided, we're going to return the favor. We're going to burn down Columbia. Now, with Columbia's destruction, there's still some debate to this day about who actually did it, what the cause was. But long story short, Columbia wasn't Columbia anymore after February 17th, 1865. Further east in Charleston, and this is actually a photograph of Columbia after its burning, summer of that year. What you see in South Carolina is that every institution in the state is falling apart. The state government cannot guarantee the safety of its citizens. The enslaved are fleeing at record numbers. The federal army by 1865 is just marching at will throughout the state. And this brings me to Charleston. This is actually from February 21st, 1865 in Charleston. This is an artist's rendering of the liberation of Charleston by the 55th Massachusetts. And as you can see here, this is an all-Black regiment marching into Charleston, being greeted by formerly enslaved people. I want you to absorb this image for a second. This is Charleston. This is the very heart of slavery, not just in South Carolina, not just in the United States, but in the Western Hemisphere. And it is being liberated by Black soldiers, some of whom were likely enslaved themselves at one point in their lives. Now, the end of the Civil War in 1865 meant the end of the institution of slavery in the South. It also, for all intents and purposes, meant the end of South Carolina as we knew it. And I believe this photograph best represents what that means. You see the once great and proud city of Charleston humbled by the end of the war. Destroyed before a few buildings and a few pillars represent what were the riches of slavery and the avarice of greed. But you see in the foreground these three young Black boys who were the first generation of Black people in this country to look towards the future, not with the foundation of the fear of slavery, but with the hope that the word freedom would, for the first time in our history, mean something for them as well. So I'm going to stop there with the fall of Charleston, because who doesn't enjoy that, and take a few questions. Again, we've covered secession and the Civil War. So are there any questions at all?
Dr. Gray, while they're collecting their thoughts, I want to lift up from Louisa, whose last name I just blanked on, the anti-socialist.
Oh, yes.
McCord, right?
Yes, that's right.
That's in your study guide. I was stunned to find out that the leading anti-communist, anti-socialist in the United States in the 1840s, there was a sentiment that she was the point of that the abolitionists were socialists, and that Louisa McCord inherited a plantation. She was lived on Pendleton Street at a house that I believe Henry McMaster owned, and right across from the university, Senate in Pendleton. And she was quite the erudite academic. Having not, women generally weren't going to college then, so she was taking care of the plantation actually, but she had been studying the revolutions and the change in politics in Europe and in France, and the Communist Manifesto was 1848. And so Louisa McCord had a national reputation for associating the cause of abolition with socialism. And so that I didn't even know that it started that soon, because Modjeska Simkins got red baited out of the NAACP she started because she was working with people that were communists. And what we'll see as we go through history, it doesn't necessarily have to be communist. It's just that our people are too stupid to think of this on their own. Somebody, outsiders coming in. I mean, when I was causing trouble, they said alleged to be from Beaufort and claiming to be, 21 and thinking I was like 47 or something. But there's always got to be the outsiders that are causing trouble. And I just wanted to share with you because that was so impactful to me. I had no idea it was a Red Scare in the 1840s and 50s.
And let me add to that as well, because I have on the screen right here about America's first Red Scare. We've had so many of them. It's hard to figure out which one's the first one. You can actually argue it's never actually ended, but I digress. But I want to add to this because during the Civil War, you actually have in the federal armies folks who were called 48ers from Germany, who fought for the federal army. And if you don't know, in 1848, there were a series of revolutions that break out throughout Europe, in France, in the German states, and divided Italy, elsewhere throughout the continent. Most of those revolutions that were for anything from liberal ideals of democracy and voting rights to radical socialism in France and so forth, Many of those revolutions were crushed in 1848, and most revolutionaries were forced to flee. Some of them fled to the US. Many of them fought in the federal armies, like Carl Schurz, for example, or General Wiedemeyer out of Missouri, because they saw the United States as the last hope for a true democratic system. Many of them were also opposed to slavery because they saw slavery as anathema to any system of democratic rules or democratic rule of law and so forth. Now, what's interesting is Wiedemeyer was actually a communist. And he was actually very active in Missouri, especially in St. Louis. And he was known amongst communists around the world as being a Union Army general. And they were like, how do you do that? And Americans didn't know, apparently, but they needed somebody to fight for them. So again, so much of this class is about South Carolina, but it's also about how the state influences national and international policy in some very interesting, strange, and provocative ways.
The disclaimer would be that everyone thinks that their place is exceptional. The school's going to set out to prove to you that South Carolina is indeed an exceptionally bad influence on civilization. That's your critical race theory, Dr. Dawson. Well, what else do we have in the study guide we need to remind people of, Robert?
Oh, let's see. Let's take a look at that.
The Port Royal is a little, it's just this little area it's in Beaufort. It's surrounded by Beaufort now. And I graduated from Beaufort High School in '66. Okay, Beaufort High School, and you drive down the main road that runs along the Beaufort River, and there's Port Royal on the right. And there was no recognition or acknowledgement of the role that it played. And it's just starting to happen with this Gullah Geechee corridor, whereas Penn Center was so front and center, because Penn Center across the river on one of the islands, Port Royal is actually on the mainland. And that Penn, we'll talk about, well, Penn was in this class, right? Because it started during the war. It was the first one, if not the first school, certainly one of them.
Right.
Because Beaufort fell so early. Beaufort fell in 1861. And so the things that happened here set the tone and some aspirations for the failure to deliver the emancipation. Because Beaufort fell early, they had the Port Royal experiment. Like Robert said, there were generals giving away land and plantations. And that 40 acres and mule thing was in that original concept that didn't pan out. But that was just another instance of South Carolina having a outsized influence on the perception of what was supposed to happen, what didn't happen, and that lives on.
I think one of the things that Brett's alluding to, really just saying outright, is it's actually incredible how much history in the state relates to ideas of freedom, but often gets downplayed. So, for instance, the study guide mentions Penn Center, Port Royal experiment, also mentions Mitchellville. Let's not forget about Mitchellville as well. You know, on Hilton Head Island, that's another place that was an example of Black freedom during this time period. And so there's a lot that the state coastline actually has to offer in terms of thinking about ideas of freedom and emancipation. And again, going back to the first Red Scare idea for a second, one of the things that's also worth noting is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the North, by the Civil War era, the ideas of free market capitalism are so widespread. Remember, they are pointing out that to them, the idea of wage labor is superior to slavery in every single way. But what some critics in the North are saying is, we might be able to do better than wage labor. And many of the folks living in Mitchellville, on Hilton Head, in the Port Royal area were Black. As they're experiencing freedom for the first time, they're also saying to themselves and to New Englanders coming in to teach them, is there no way for us to develop alternate systems of thinking about the economy, where we have more control over not only the land, but the very labor we have?
The Atlanta Compromises, next class.
I believe so. Yeah,
We don't want to
we've touched on it, yes.
spoil the punchlines here.
You can see here, there's, of course, I see someone in the chat has put John Brown's body in the chat, so that's just the song, not the actual body.
Secret questions.
I'm looking right now. Herb Fraser makes a great point. He mentions that the tradition of watch night services in the US began in 1862. In case you don't know, the first watch night services were held in Black churches across the North, awaiting word of the Emancipation Proclamation on December 31st, 1862. And special couriers were sent out across the country to announce it on January 1st. And so that's watch night is actually a commemoration of that event. Any questions in the chat?
Drop your screen, man.
I will also mention, because this relates to the Civil War era, in case you don't know, I mentioned Charleston in a class tonight. The first Memorial Day service was held in Charleston in 1865. And it was a service held by Black Charlestonians to consecrate the Union dead in Charleston, who had died in the POW camp there, who had died taking the city. Black Charlestonians had basically reburied those Union dead with a proper Christian burial. That was the first Memorial Day service in US history.
Called Decoration Day.
Decoration Day, exactly. Hampton Park in Charleston, exactly.
I have another question.
Go ahead, please.
So time is like in my head. I'm trying to really understand. So several generations have died, over these periods of enslavement. And so there's an oral tradition trying to keep memory of the past and things, but it's probably eroded a great deal. I'm just trying to get a picture of what this community life was like. They were from different areas, like different communities, so they didn't even know one another in the enslaved populations. They're just thrown with people that they don't know from before and things like that. And then over time, people are passing away. So is there any way that the oral traditions are being preserved at this point, or are they pretty much flatlined from, the homeland?
Well, if you're talking about oral traditions from Africa, then some of those are kept alive. It's very difficult to do, but they continue to do so generation to generation, even if in some cases it changes some form or some meaning. But there are ways of keeping that alive. However, I would, if you pardon me, I would add that your question is actually bigger than you might think, because it points to how there has always been a tradition amongst first the enslaved and then Black citizens of the United States of keeping together traditions that may have been ignored by the larger white population. So for example, I just mentioned Memorial Day / Decoration Day. For generations amongst Black Americans, January 1st was Emancipation Day. And there were mass celebrations across the South and Northern enclaves as well of Emancipation Day. You can see photographs of people putting out, paintings of Abraham Lincoln, of Frederick Douglass, having marches in cities across the South commemorating Emancipation Day. Juneteenth, I think, is the best known example of this now. That's a tradition from Oklahoma and Texas that actually reflects into the Civil War. If you don't know what Juneteenth is all about, in essence, Texas, being Texas, did not really concede that the war was over until federal troops got there in June of 1865. In fact, in Texas, they kind of thought, well, the Confederacy surrendered, but we didn't. It didn't lose the war. Those idiots in the Carolinas did. And in Virginia, we never lost here, but they did and eventually surrender. But of course, the enslaved were not told about the Emancipation Proclamation, or they had heard of it, but it wasn't enforced until troops got there in 1865. And so what Juneteenth commemorates is the final group of Black Americans being told they were free in Texas. But it's also a reflection of how chaotic the Civil War's end was. Like, we think of the Civil War as ending when Robert E. Lee surrenders. It's not entirely true. You still had Confederate troops surrendering in May and June of that year in North Carolina, and of course out in Texas as well. And also the idea of fighting to defend slavery didn't just die overnight, as we're going to see next week. Any other questions?
Well, Dr. Green, what's the next class?
Well, next week, we are going to get into Reconstruction, a very, unimportant period in history of the state of South Carolina. But all seriousness, we're going to cover Reconstruction next week. We may be joined by Vernon Burton next Monday.
Say again?
Will Vernon Burton be joining us next Monday?
We don't know yet.
You don't, yeah, you'll know before class if he's going to be with us. But either way, you're getting Reconstruction. The important thing about next week's discussion is that if you're thinking about what is a fork in the road in the history of South Carolina, it's Reconstruction. Reconstruction throughout the country is known as this period of tumult and chaos in the South. But Reconstruction reaches its most radical promise in South Carolina. And so you're going to hear about folks you've probably heard of before, but in different contexts. What you're going to see is that the state is at the center of every major Reconstruction debate, whether it's about giving Black men the right to vote, giving Black people land, defending their civil rights. All of that you're going to see play out in the Palmetto State, and you're also going to see the backlash to Reconstruction play out in the Palmetto State as well. So you're going to get Reconstruction next week, and you're going to see just how far South Carolina went from being a state that was a slave society to being a state that actually embraced a radical idea of democracy. So that's what's on deck for next week.
Thank you, Dr. Green. We have a rousing tune to close out with, but let's get back to a bit.